Good morning and welcome to Black Mental Health Matters. Today we're discussing supporting adolescents and teenagers through a trauma informed approach. And with me is Dr. Cloud. Dr. Cloud has been a guest on this show several times and therefore he needs no introduction, I think. But feel free, Dr. Cloud, to share a bit about yourself with our audience.
Like Miss Sonia said, my name is Dr. Cloud. I've been a guest numerous times, so I really don't need a long introduction. I am a current social worker in North Carolina. I'm an adjunct professor at a few universities, and then I also run my own nonprofit addressing mental health for African American men. So thank you for having me again today.
Okay, Dr. Cloud, tell me a bit about the trauma informed approach. Just give me a brief definition on what it is.
So the trauma-informed approach, when we look at it, and we can look at it from many different ways, it pretty much is a way to address traumatic trauma within our clients. But we're looking at addressing in a way that does not reintroduce them to the trauma that will kind of, try to figure out the right word, to re-traumatize. What we're trying to do is we're trying to address the trauma, but we're trying to address it in a positive and a safe environment so we can promote healing within our clients.
Awesome
This is
response.
in a brief words.
Yeah. So, how does trauma impact the behavior and the development of adolescents and teenagers?
So trauma significantly impacts our behavior in our teenage and adolescent, depending on the type of trauma. So we first need to break it down and look at exactly what trauma are we addressing, right? Because then that will let you know exactly what we're dealing with and how we handle it. So we're looking at sexual trauma, right? So, say for instance, sexual abuse, such as rape, molestation. What we see in our adolescents and teenagers that are going through sexual abuse, such as rape or molestation, is that we're seeing promiscuous behavior. Unfortunately, we're seeing suicidal ideation. We are seeing aggressive behavior as well, or we're also seeing regressive behavior, which means that that adolescent or that child is regressing back into themselves and building up a wall because they don't want anybody to touch them, nor do they want to seek help because they don't want to talk about the sexual trauma. And that also does create issues later in adulthood with connecting to people. So that's kind of what one of the effects is. Now, if we're not looking at sexual trauma, if we're looking at a child that has seen physical trauma, so such as a child who is a victim of child abuse and neglect, or a child who has witnessed any type of abuse in the household, such as domestic violence, what we're seeing again is that this child will either start to emulate that behavior in adolescence or teenage years. And again, we're looking at if the child was a victim of child abuse and neglect, that child will have a hard time connecting with fellow adolescents and teenagers. That child will have a hard time connecting with adults or going to people that adults that they trust. That child will have acts of aggression or anger issues, which can lead to imprisonment, depending on the type of environment. Or that child will start to adapt those behaviors as well. So, for instance, a child who has seen domestic violence in the household, as they get older, they may start to think that it's okay to hit. And that is one of the effects of witnessing that type of trauma. Just to give a few examples, I know that was a lot, but that's just to give a few examples of how does trauma affect our adolescents and our teenagers, because we have to look at all these different subcategories of trauma.
What is coming up for me, and from based on what you're saying, is that if this behavior is left untreated, not managed or changed, that the teenager, the adolescent, then becomes that adult who continues in these negative behavior patterns. Is that a given?
That is a given, and the only reason why is because if therapy is not utilized, once the child or trauma informed approach is not utilized, once the child has been traumatized, that means that their trauma has never been addressed. That means that their child has been carrying it from adolescence to teenage to adulthood to late adulthood. So just imagine, or just try to imagine, for those who probably have never been through trauma before, what that would look like. So if I was abused as a child, and then that abuse continued to a teenage years, and then I started being aggressive and abusing other people, right? I started hitting, fighting, abusing my own children because that's how I was raised. And then later adulthood, the pattern kind of continued. That trauma was never addressed. So when you look at these families and they're saying things such as, well, well, my mom hit me, so I hit my kids, and now my kids hit their kids. The trauma started with your mother, and it was never addressed, right? And so we never kind of, it's the generational curses, I think is what we're going to call it, what most people call it. We never really broke those generational curses. We kind of just let them, get passed down each generation until somebody finally said, "Oh, we're not doing this. We're going to address this trauma right here and right now." So that's predominantly what I'm saying.
So this is why it is important to be able to see when a child is going through trauma and address that. The other question I want to ask, if you're in a school setting where you're meeting young people and you recognize the symptoms of a child carrying trauma, how do you go about helping that child? I don't want to say without the parent's permission, because I know sometimes as a parent we cannot see. We don't always see what's going on right in front of our eyes. But let's say you are caretaker, you're working in the school system, and you notice that little Johnny's behaving different. There's this drastic change in behavior. Is there legislation for intervention?
So when we notice, because I used to work in pre-K to 12, so as a social worker. So when we notice that there's trauma with a child, what we usually do first is we do involve the parent. That's automatic because we have to have parental consent, depending on what the trauma may be. So this is so let me kind of caveat on this. So if we're looking at allegations of child abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, we don't need a parent's permission. All we need is child protective services, and they come out, they do the investigation. Let me caveat and put that in there. But if we are just dealing with like the child is witnessing any type of domestic abuse, or anything like that, we typically will ask the parent, have you noticed any behavior changes in your child? What is going on? Do you think anything has changed in your child, and what do you believe could be the cause of it? Because we like to get more than one picture. And then, of course, with the parents' permission, we'll have the conversation with the child of, well, tell me what's been going on lately with you. What's new, any issues, anything like that, for the child can give us their feedback as well. And what we'll do is we will have what we call a multidisciplinary team meeting, which will be usually the school social worker, the school psychologist, the school counselor, and then usually whichever the VP, the vice principal who's over our student conduct or affairs. And so what that allows is for us all come together as different healthcare professionals, and see and look at the child from more than one viewpoint. So I will say, for example, when I worked in pre-K through 12,
That is very, very.
I'm sorry.
No, I think that is very interesting that you speak to the parent first. You include the parent,
Yes, because
unless the parent is the perpetrator.
yeah,
If
unless
I'm
parents
hearing
are
correctly,
perpetrator.
unless the parent is the perpetrator.
Yes. So in North Carolina, one thing, because I used to work in CPS too. So one thing is that if we suspected any type of trauma, we had to figure out what it was first. So most of the times, say that a child a child has marks and bruises. We don't speak to the parent first. We're not legally, we're not allowed to.
Okay,
We
that's
have
interesting
to,
too.
because in North Carolina, that is considered a it's been so long since I've been a CPS. I gotta remember the name. It's called a forensic case. So it's called a forensic case. So what that means is that if we notice marks and bruises on a child, or the child says that oh, I've been sexually assaulted, right? We don't notify the parents. We notify crimes against children, which is our police department unit for children. And we had a conversation with the child, not the parent. Now we have if we have a child who says, "Oh, I saw mom and dad fighting, or mom left me home alone. Those are non-forensic. We speak to the parent first to figure out, okay, has this child been traumatized from being left home alone, or because mom hasn't been feeding them a lot of food. So North Carolina laws on trauma and CPS involvement and school social worker involvement are very, they have some gray areas, but they are very straightforward.
Okay, so I'm going to ask this question because what I'm hearing is having a safe and supportive environment for adolescents and teenagers, for children in general. So, how does a trauma informed approach create such a space, create such an environment?
So can you repeat that question one more time? I want to make sure I heard all of it.
How does a trauma informed approach create a safe and supportive environment for adolescents, teenagers, young children, for children in general? Let's say children in general.
So a trauma-informed approach, it gives a child a safe space, because what it says is that we understand the trauma, right? We know the trauma, we know what's going on, but in this area that you're in, you have a safe space to talk about that trauma and not be trying to find the right words today, and not be judged or not feel like that needs to be fixed right now, right? So when we're doing trauma informed, we're making sure that we're not re-traumatizing, but that we are addressing the trauma. So your safe space is saying that this you do not have to be re-traumatized, but you can talk freely about the trauma if you so wish. And I can give an example of that as well. When I worked for outpatient mental health, we were talking about domestic violence. And as we were talking about domestic violence, I started to cry. I was in grad school. I started crying out of the blue. Don't know why I was crying. Couldn't figure it out to save my life until my director said, "Have you ever witnessed domestic violence before? And have you ever talked to anybody about it?" And I said, "Well, I have witnessed domestic violence before, but I've never talked about it." So I never addressed that trauma in my childhood. So in my adulthood, when we were simply having this deep conversation about domestic violence, that trauma decided to make its way to the surface because I was in a safe space to talk about it now. I never was in a safe space as a child to talk about it. It's like I witnessed it. I never got to talk about it. It was just kind of like I've seen it, but it's one of those things you kind of suppress to the back of your mind because you don't want to talk about it. But
I was just
again,
going to say that.
yeah,
That you keep that locked into your subconscious mind until something comes up and the subconscious mind pushes it back to the conscious mind, but you're not recognizing it because you don't really have, or you haven't been carrying that memory as a
mm,
current thing that is happening. That's very
exactly.
interesting because very often we see people acting out
Hmm.
and we think they're just behaving badly for whatever reason, but we're not looking below the surface to see if they've had trauma in their life. And I think all of us experience trauma of some type. But we just think, oh, that person's just behaving badly. And it just confirms that the mind is more sensitive than we think, that it carries so many things within it. And yes, we can, camouflage it and cover it up, but it is still there.
Exactly.
I
And
guess
that's
having an open sore that you allow to just fester and fester until one day you get gangrene and they got to cut the whole limb off or something. And I and I think that's what we do at a soul level. We carry things within us that we don't address because we're not having these open discussions where people are being educated about trauma and the impact that it have on our overall life. Yes, it may start when we're very young, but it reflects based on the lifestyle that we have as we become adults, how we're living our life, how we're expressing ourselves as adults.
exactly. And you make a very good point. When you repression of trauma, like I said earlier, when it's not treated in adolescence or when you're a teenager, it does show up in adulthood. And that's why I'm glad to get an example, because that repression of trauma showed up in my adulthood. And that is one of the things, even now that I'm older, when I am looking at trauma informed approaches and safe spaces, is make sure that we address all trauma.
Yeah, and I like that answer. And I like that you're sharing your own experiences because this makes it very real. Because very often we think that males don't connect to things at an emotional level, they don't feel things the same way. So I like that you've gone there, and I trust that our audience, especially the males, recognize that it is okay to be vulnerable. It is okay to tell their story to someone that they trust to get the help that is needed, especially if you're a young person, a teenager, adolescent, or even younger. Dr. Cloud, what are some effective strategies that you and maybe your colleagues have used for building trust and communication with traumatized adolescents and teenagers?
So for me and my colleagues to build trust with teenagers and adolescents, we all use different methods. For me, I laugh though when I look at it. For me, building trust with teenagers and adolescents is I play sports with them. So
Okay.
the thing what I do in therapy is I do not like therapy inside the office. And I like to do therapy with my clients, especially teenagers and adolescents. I usually like to do therapy depending on where they're at. So for my young kids, people might do play therapy. I do Play-Doh. We do Connect Four. We do Uno. We do all of these things. And not only am I building trust and rapport, but I'm also having a conversation with them that doesn't feel like it's counseling. For
Awesome.
my
And I like that approach. I
and
like
for
that
my
approach.
And for my adolescents, sometimes it's the same thing, but it's a little bit different. So I may be playing football with them. I may be playing basketball. We might be outside doing some type of outdoor activity, but it's the same approach. We're having conversation, we're laughing, and it doesn't feel like counseling to them either. But we know it was counseling because we're talking about all the trauma, but we're kind of having fun in the process, so it doesn't feel so overwhelming for that client at the same time. I've done cooking with clients before, with my teenagers before, in the office setting. If so, or if I do at home therapy, I do cooking, in the kitchen with my clients. So it just depends. That's how I build my trust and rapport. I meet my adolescent teenagers where they're at. I like to learn their
I mean,
interests. Yeah, I like to learn their interests, and from their interests, that's how we do our therapy. I had one client; he loved to play basketball. We would play basketball and be doing therapy. Every shot I made,
I have
I hmm,
I have a friend who said to me, she's a swim coach. She's also a life coach. And she
hmm.
said to me, very often, a lot of people who come to her swim classes just want to talk about their traumas, about what's going on in their life. So she finds that the swimming classes are twofold. It's not just about teaching them to swim, but it's also a life coaching session.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And my kids love it because I'm not doing traditional therapy, and I never believe in traditional therapy most of the time. With adults, yes, because we're kind of stuck in our ways by this point. But with adolescents and teenagers, we could be a little bit more flexible. So with them, I like to make it fun. I mean, we're talking about trauma. I want to make sure we're talking about this trauma that we're doing in a environment that you feel safe and secure in. So that's out in the field running, or out in the field doing some type of sport or whatever we're doing. That's how I want that to look like.
I like that idea very much. Learning while doing. I like that. Having fun while engaging in some serious stuff. And I've seen this play out here in Barbados at a company called Higher Heights, where we do outdoor adventure training for corporate Barbados. And some schools have actually brought their children up to learn how to, one, become leaders, be motivational, give them that motivational stuff. And I
Mm.
like that approach, experiential learning, because I think that when you go there, you absorb the information much better. And I always refer to it as fun while learning. So I definitely like that approach. So, what are some of the potential challenges that you have found in terms of implementing the trauma informed approach?
So I think some of the barriers or that we have found is that some adolescent teenagers are resistant to therapy, and that's a big thing because I talked about this before in one of our previous conversations. So I think this is perfect to mention it now. It is this ideology that we give to our children that what happens in this house stays in this house. Don't talk to a stranger about household problems, right? And we've talked about this before, and so there is a big impact to how we address trauma and why we have barriers because kids will come to me, teenagers come to me and say, "Well, my mom told me that I should talk about these problems outside the household." Or, well, my mom told me that we don't talk about our family problems to strangers, right? Or I would get all of these different barriers, or, the child has just been so traumatized that they regress within themselves. So they don't trust anybody. No, mom, dad, therapist, they just don't want to talk to anybody because they don't trust nobody. And so that's a barrier within itself because you're trying to pull them out, right?
That's interesting.
Help them yeah, you're trying to help them come out of this wall that they built for to help them kind of heal, but that is a barrier because the child does not want anybody to be near them. They don't want to let anybody in, and so that, like you said, it's festering, right? It's kind of like gangrene. So that child does not want to let that pain go, that hurt go, and so we have another barrier because if we can't break through, it's going to lead to more issues.
That is true. As you were speaking, this question came up in helping young people, adolescents, and teenagers through the trauma informed approach. Are parents also included in that same therapy? Because I often think that sometimes we're healing one aspect of the family and the other, the parental unit, is still pretty much set where they are. There's no change for them. So the child is still in that environment where I think the trauma is being reinforced, especially if the parents are not being treated as well and they're not healing along with the child. And that's just my thinking. I think that you have to look at a whole family healing rather than say, okay, the adolescent here is traumatized, so let me just work with the adolescent. But
So
you're back in the same environment.
So I will say that that is true, what you're saying, but I'll also say this. So it depends on the trauma for the child, right? It depends on exactly what type of trauma we are addressing. Now, if it's sometimes I ask a teenager or a child, do you want mom or dad to be here, or whoever the person is that traumatized the child, and I would let them make that decision. Self autonomy, client self determination. But also in the same regards, I do like for parents to join sometime because what you see, and I've seen it only a few times in my career, what we see is this: mom or dad or whoever joins the therapy session with the child, and everything comes out in the process. And sometimes the parents are healing, as you're saying, because what the parents are doing is saying, and this is rare for me to see this: parents are starting to apologize to their children, and it's very rare to me because growing up, especially in the African American community, black parents do not apologize too fast. They don't care how wrong they are. They don't care what they did to you. They're not gonna apologize too fast. And so it's very interesting to see that in certain therapy when I'm watching client interact with their parents, parents are apologizing to their children for the trauma that they have put them through. They're apologizing because they realize that they could have done better. They could have protected them more. That they had their own trauma, and versus dealing with it when they should have, they were passing this trauma on to their child, and that they are trying to do better. They just don't know how to do better. And so I do think that it is twofold. One side of it is that it's very good because the parent trauma is getting healed. The other side of it is that we still have to make sure that we're not re-traumatizing that child as well. So we have to make sure that the child is not only comfortable with the parent being in there, but also that the child is not going to be re-traumatized from what the parent is saying to them. because we don't want to be 10 steps ahead and then get knocked 20 steps back because we have re-traumatized because we had decided to include a parent into that therapy session.
Yeah, I can understand that. Being a parent, you have these moments where you may not want to deal with the trauma. You might feel guilty, especially if let's say, for argument's sake, you leave your children with a relative who molests your children sexually. You might feel a sense of guilt. And therefore, I think it is important that to be healed.
Yes.
You know, you have to build a strong caregiver. And I want to use the word caregiver because not all children are with their biological parents, but
Nope.
a strong caregiver environment where that caregiver also understands the trauma informed approach, and they too are a part of that. It is like, and I'm going to go to the Bible where Jesus speaks of putting new wine into old wine vessels, because you're taking that child, you put it back in the same environment, same mindset. And I think you have to change the mindset of everyone in that child's environment. And by environment, I mean the home setting. You have to bring them along. You definitely have to bring them along. And with that, my next question, Dr. Cloud, is how does a trauma informed system support the natural resilience of young people?
So I will say that the trauma-informed approach creates strong resilience in children and young people, because it gives them this extra strength. And I know most people may not know what I'm talking about or what that looks like, but I'm gonna tell you what that should look like. So when you're using the trauma-informed approach, you have given the child their voice back, right? Think of it like, oh, here's a good example. Think of it like the Little Mermaid, how Ursula stole her voice, and then when she finally got it back, she was very strong. She was very much her whole self again. And I know plenty of parents have probably seen this movie by now, whichever version. So think of it like that with children. When we give children a trauma-informed approach, we are giving them their voice, right? We are giving them the room to say that this is what you did to me, or this is the trauma that I suffered, and this is what I'm not allowing, right? This is what I want you to hear about how that trauma affected me and what I am doing to make sure that this trauma does not affect me moving forward. We are giving our young people the voice with a trauma informed approach, because one, we are telling them that this trauma is not their future. Okay, they don't have to hold on to it. Two, we're telling them that this trauma, it can't. I always hate telling people that it can be healed, but this trauma can be addressed, because most people don't want to heal from their trauma. They usually want to hold on to it. So I would tell people your trauma is being addressed. So we're giving these young people the power to address their trauma and make the decision if they want to heal or to let it fester.
Okay.
That's
Understood.
why
Because I was
the,
also going to question you on the word heal, because I think that, healing is important so that
it
you don't have
is
a repeat of that situation. I know
it
that there's some
is
things you cannot completely heal from, like the common cold. That will come once there's cold and flu season. But I think the trauma is concerned that you can heal from a specific trauma. And you can also have tools to deal with trauma in general that you can use to deal with trauma, because as life unfolds, things will happen
hmm
that will cause you to feel pain. But if you have the tools to deal with those issues in life, then your
exactly.
trauma, whenever it comes up, you say, you know what, this is what this is. This is how I'm going to deal with it. Rather than carrying it on your back like it's a sack of books of knowledge. And even then, you don't want to walk around with a sack of books of knowledge on your back. You want to have them where, you can read them and put them aside. You can share them. You don't want to carry burden on your back.
Exactly. And I think that's the thing that we have to understand is that once we give our young people their voice back, we really realize that a lot of the trauma it gets addressed quicker, and that they heal quicker. That's what I've realized in my therapy approaches.
Say that again, please. I'm not
So what I
sure that I understand that
so
totally.
so so pretty much is so let me break it down. When you give young people the voice, right? The voice to be their own leader, we are giving them the power to say that I'm addressing the trauma that happened to me so I can heal the trauma that has occurred. That is what I'm saying. Because when you do not give a child room to voice their trauma or their opinion, what we're basically saying is that you do not have the power or the right or your own autonomy to heal from this trauma unless I say so.
I
And
like
that
that.
is,
That's quite interesting.
yes, because we're basically telling this child that every decision that you make, everything that you're going through is on my behalf. You address it or you heal it when I want you to. When if you've been raped, abused, neglected, whatever, I don't need to talk to you about this right now. This so you don't I don't need to give my input. And this is what we see in a lot of black household is that you hurt me, okay, but I don't want to talk about it. So you need to deal with it on your own terms, but don't bring me into your drama. So we're basically saying
I want
that
to
I don't.
ask.
Hmm,
I'm going to cross you here because I don't want to forget this point. But I'm going
hmm,
to ask this question because what I'm hearing is that a lot of what we as black parents do could be residual of life on the plantation where we didn't have a voice, where we just had to do what we were told. We couldn't question things. And maybe, just maybe, this pattern of behavior has been passed on, from generation to generation. You don't talk because I'm an authority here, and because I'm an authority here as a parent, you really don't have anything to say. I've heard of cases where parents actually blame young girls who have been raped for the rape. It's like, well, that's your fault. Why did you go this place? Why were you wearing what you're wearing? I told you not to do this. Um, it is really sad when the education is out there where we can educate ourselves to be better parents, to
hmm.
understand our children better, to really allow them the freedom to speak, to tell us what is going on and to address it. But in hearing you speak, I'm thinking maybe, just maybe, a lot of these behavior patterns of not allowing our children to have that voice is residual from a life of being captive and being a slave, not having the freedom to express yourself as who you really came here to be. And by that I mean all of us are made in the image and likeness of God, and we want to express our own creative uniqueness. But when you are put in a bubble and say, well, this is where you belong, I honestly believe that some of it has been passed on. And I think I can say that even with my own parents growing up, where we were not, I don't want to say given that love. I mean, I know that my parents loved us, but it was never expressed. We were given all the material comfort that we could be given. But in terms of the hugs as a young girl and, and I love you, that was never expressed.
And you're right. So, and I love that you're saying that because you're giving me an example that I've seen too often. My parents never told me that they love me, or my parents never really were affectionate, right? And I've heard this plenty of times. And so it would cause me to not be affectionate and show my children that I love them. I love my children, I do, but I don't know how to show my children that I love them. Or since I never heard I love you before, I don't know how to really show it. And I like that example because in my own personal life, and I don't mind sharing, like my grandmother was never an affectionate person. I'm an affectionate person. My mom tells me, I love you, everything. My grandmother is like pulling teeth. And so as my grandmother has gotten older, now she's a little bit more affectionate. towards me. Because I would tell my
Yeah.
grandmother, yeah, I would tell my grandmother one thing that I'm not gonna do is when I say I love you, you're gonna learn to say it back. And so now she says it back now that she's a little bit older because she had to kind of break that cycle of, well, my mom never really told me I loved you or really showed it. But again, my grandmother grew up in a different era, so it's kind of addressing that lack of affection and kind of trying to break it. Even if it's not with her children, with her grandchildren, and she's learning to kind
Yeah.
of break it.
Yeah. And I see that with my mother and her grandchildren, where she will hug them and she would love on them and she'll tell them that she loves them. And I'm happy for that, you know. I am happy for that because they
But
can see no wrong with their grandmother. They just see the perfect grandmother. But I, growing up as a daughter, would say, you know what, mom didn't have me, mom didn't do this, but she was a great provider.
yeah,
My father
because
was also a great provider
yeah,
for
exactly.
the material things, yeah.
Yeah,
For the material things, they made sure that we had the things that we needed.
exactly. So that's a so like
Yeah,
so to go back to your original question, I do think some of it is residual from the trauma that we experienced as Black people over 200 and something years ago. Because we have to remember that slavery is not that far away, even if we want to believe it. Um, And so I do still think that we have some of their residual trauma of, in authority. I can sabotage you and we don't address it because you didn't address the slave master when he was beating you or raping you.
no,
So
we
why?
didn't.
So yeah, exactly. So it's kind of we still have some of that residual that you don't question authoritative figure in your life, and I think that is one of the biggest issues that we are also facing with trauma.
Yeah, and I think that that's why a lot of abuse happens because young people are taught not to question the power of those who are in authority, even within the church setting. It is unspoken that whatever they do is okay, but then
Exactly.
there's that trauma to your soul, and sometimes you
Exactly.
just don't know how to express and who to trust because if the person in authority is causing you pain, who do you trust?
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest issue is who do I go to when the person I love the most is the one causing me the trauma and I cannot talk to them? That's the question.
Yeah, those are some very well, the next question was going to be on culture and how can a trauma informed system be inclusive and culturally sensitive so that we address the unique needs and experiences of a diverse population. And you know that diversity today have many different shades. It is not just religious diversity and ethnicity, but also sexual diversity in terms of how we identify gender wise.
Repeat that question one more time because that was a long question. So
It's a big question. I know it's a big question because I'm going to put it very simple. How does an informed, trauma informed system assist with the cultural, keeping
okay,
things culturally sensitive, especially as it relates to diversity? And then I went on to talk about LGBTQ, you know, because they're part of our society too. How do we keep things have a trauma informed approach so that everyone is included?
okay, I get it now. So basically, the way to have a trauma informed approach that is culturally diverse, right, is to learn. So trauma informed care is not a band aid for everybody. I'm so sorry. So you have to look at everybody's culture because that is the only way to address the trauma. So when you are looking at trauma informed care and you're trying to make sure that you are culturally appropriate, culturally diverse, you have to know exactly what type of culture you are working with. You have to also know some of that culture's history. So if you're working with African Americans, of course, slavery is one of the biggest traumatic things that we've had, right? If you are working with somebody who's Jewish, the Holocaust was one of the biggest traumatic things in their history. If you're working with somebody from, Africa, depending on what part of Africa, apartheid was one of the biggest traumatic things in their history, and so on and so forth. Learning their culture's history, learning the traumatic things in their history as well, will kind of help you be a little bit more culturally sensitive as well. Secondly, what we have to look at is that for trauma informed care is for any culture is how do they like to address it, right? So when we're looking at our Caucasian counterparts, they strongly believe in therapy because there's not that much trauma for our Caucasian counterparts. There are the issues for a lot of trauma, but they don't have too much trauma in their history. You can't really give me. I always tell people you cannot really give me a major traumatic event for white people. Then you can give me for any other culture, and it's not to be culturally insensitive. It's just to say that when you look at history, they are predominantly the reason for that traumatic event, right? So when we're looking at African Americans, we're looking at, of course, like I said, slavery, and then also we're looking at family familiar structure. So how's that family set up, right? So some families are patriarchs. Some families are matriarch families, right? My family is a matriarch family. So you look at how the trauma comes down from the matriarch to the family, how it's steamed down as well. Or for Indian culture, most Indian culture or Muslim culture is a patriarchy. So basically is that I have to look at exactly how is the systems of this culture set up, and that lets me know how to work around this trauma. I remember when I had a Muslim client, it was forbidden for her to speak to me without a male present, without a male speak to me because I
Yeah,
was a male.
without her Wally. Yeah.
Yes, because I was a male social worker, but it was not forbidden for her to speak to a female social worker and without needing another male present. And
Yeah.
it was the weirdest thing to me, but because I didn't understand Muslim culture at that time. And so what I ended up doing to make sure that one that this client had her trauma addressed is I had my coworker come with me. And so what I had my coworker do, I would have her speak to the female client. I never said any word. All I did was take notes. So everything that the client was saying, I was just writing the notes down. I was just the note taker. But my female counterpart was the one speaking to her. So I was kind of finding a little loophole into that I'll have to work with that client and her trauma. As long as I wasn't the one I was speaking to her, there's no reason a male to be there. If a male Muslim, because my female counterpart was there. All I was there for was just to take notes. I never said a word. I never spoke up. All I did was sit right there and just sit the notes to make sure everything was transcribed the way that it was supposed to be. And that is how we were able to get that client to work with us and feel comfortable having a conversation without the abuser being there, because the abuser was her husband. But because Muslim culture dictates that a male must be present when when a female is around another male, she couldn't talk about that trauma openly.
Understood. Understood. And I know that the foundation for that is just a belief. Just a
Yes.
belief that if a male and a female are together, then there's going to be a third person in the room, which is the shy town. Unfortunately, and I agree with you that understanding people's cultural differences is very important as a therapist because you
Hmm.
can do things to offend. You can offend other people, and that's why it is important, very important to respect people where they're at.
I forgot to take my
And it's
shoes off one time when I was visiting a family, and their culture was you take your shoes off at the door. I didn't know anything about it, and I accidentally offended them. And I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I go back and take my shoes off," but I didn't know, so they had taught me something new. So every time I visited them, my shoes were off at the front door. It was weird to me, but it was their culture. So when they told me what the reason was, well, it was a Chinese family. Once they told me the reason why, I was like, "Oh, I
yeah, and
know
it's to meet people where they're at as therapists, as counselors. It's to meet them where they're at. And
exactly."
once you can do that, We just have to be flexible. And
Exactly.
therefore, we're coming up to the hour.
Okay.
But I have one more question for you. And that question is, how does a trauma informed system prioritize the well being and the mental health of adolescents and teenagers in its approach?
Mental and spiritual well-being trauma informed approach for teenagers and adolescents. It goes back to it gives them a voice. It goes back to that they feel secure and safe, right? It goes back to that they know how to address this trauma and heal from it, right? Because like you said earlier, when we let trauma fester, it is not good for our soul, but it's also not good for here, right? And so when we are using the trauma informed approach, we are letting our teenagers and our adolescents have a voice and addressing this trauma, we are giving them that power back. And it starts to heal them mentally, spiritually, and emotionally and mentally. And you start to see these changes. You start to see the lack of aggression. You start to see the wall coming down. You start to see, more effective communication. You start to see more open discussion about the trauma and what the trauma did to them, right? And how they're trying to address it. That's what a trauma informed approach does. Like we're not re-traumatizing, but we are surely talking about it and how it has managed to heal. And at the center of it all, how it has managed to fully heal. And I think that is one of the greatest things.
I think that's very important that young people have that place, that safe place, and persons that they can reach out to help them on the path of healing. Because I think the longer it takes you to get into that place of healing, the harder it becomes to heal. And if we can capture that trauma at a young age, I think we're going to see a world that is awesome to live in. We're going to see people who are kinder to each other, more loving to each other, and more respectful. And that's my hope for all humanity. That
Exactly.
we're in a place where we can all just get along well with each other without being overly aggressive. I'm not saying that aggression is bad because there are times when you need to set your boundaries very firmly, but
Exactly.
where we're not overly aggressive to the point where we cause self harm and the harm of others.
Exactly.
Are there any final words from you, Dr. Cloud, on this topic?
I think the only thing I would say here is that we need to let teenagers and adolescents speak when they've been hurt, and that would solve so many problems in the future, and that would let them know that they always have a safe space to come to when they are going through this.
Awesome, well said, yes, and I agree with you there. One of the unfortunate things I think that has happened is that a lot of religious institutions have not stepped up and created those safe places for young people. And by the same token, a lot of parents are keeping their children away from religious institutions for whatever
Exactly.
reason. But from where I stand, I still think that spiritual institutions, religious institutions, still have a strong foundation if, and what I said, if they're given that spiritual support and guidance in a safe way by trained persons within those organizations. And with that, I would like to thank you for watching Black Mental Health Matters. I would like to thank Dr. Cloud for his knowledge and wisdom on this topic. And I wish each and every one of you who have joined us a pleasant Saturday. Thank you all so much.
Thank you
Until
all.